A centrifuge is a machine that takes uranium and processes it. One purpose that you can use a centrifuge for is to produce enriched uranium at 3 to 5%, and you would use that to fuel a nuclear power plant. You could enrich it up to 20% and use it for fuel in a medical research reactor. You could also enrich it up to 90% and use that for either fuel for a submarine or for nuclear weapons.
I first started studying the Mujahideen Khalq when I was, at the time, an analyst at the RAND Corporation. The MEK was founded by several graduate students at the University of Tehran in the mid-60s to oppose the Shah's government. Their intent was to be violent. They took up arms. They, in fact, assassinated 6 Americans and tried to assassinate others. They blew up various American businesses in Iran. In the last several years, the Mujahideen Khalq has been lobbying on Capitol Hill, primarily to get its designation as a foreign terrorist organization removed, so that the group could be this parliament in waiting that could just be parachuted into Tehran to become the new government.
There was a time when, of course, Iraq was invaded, Afghanistan was invaded, and Iran is right there in between. So I think that there was quite a bit of nervousness after the whole axis of evil rhetoric as well from the Bush administration that Iran would be next.
I was the New York Times bureau chief in Istanbul, in Turkey. And one day, as often happens when you're a foreign correspondent, I got a note from my boss in New York saying, even though Iran is not one of the countries you're assigned to cover, you got to go to Iran because an election is happening. That was the campaign that produced Mohammad Khatami, so that was in the late 1990s. 2 weeks of driving around Iran was a completely fascinating experience. On the one hand, you have this country that's one of the oldest and most culturally rich nations in the world, first empire in human history, and produced all this poetry and science. You look at the culture and the background of that nation, and then you see where they are now, and something seems to have gone very wrong. Mossadegh was overthrown in 1953. That made him the first foreign leader deposed by the CIA.
I grew up in Tehran, the capital. I lived in a housing complex in downtown Tehran where middle, upper class families lived. We had a huge garden. It was as big as a park. Persian food was what I grew up on. Rice is the staple food in Iran, and we usually have it with a kind of stew. My mother cooked mostly Persian food, and of course pasta was the favorite food of every child in those days in Iran as well. I went to a private American school in Tehran until 1980, actually. When the Islamic Revolution took place, Khomeini denounced all private schools. I grew up skiing. A lot of people don't know that Iran is a mountainous country, and we get a lot of snow in our mountains. It's all natural, powdery snow. Dozens of us kids who grew up there and are scattered around the world talk about remembering those days with a lot of good memories.
Getting a nuclear weapon in that neighborhood is not going to change the balance of power in a significant way. It's not going to make this regime more secure. It's not going to make this regime be able to break its isolation either. In fact, it's going to make itself more of a target. It's going to be viewed as a greater threat. Even if you have 10 of them, what can you really realistically achieve when Israel, for instance, has more than 200 nuclear weapons and, unlike Iran, also has a second strike capability, meaning that Israel could survive a nuclear attack and still destroy the attacker, something that the Iranians don't have because they don't have a nuclear weapon, they don't have a delivery system, and they certainly don't have a second strike capability.
It's worth bearing in mind that the United States is extremely isolated on Iran. I mean, Europe goes along, but almost no one else. Like, if there were accurate reporting, or any reporting at all, it would tell us that in the region, in the Arab world, which is after all critical, there's overwhelming support for Iran in opposition to the U.S. policy. In fact, support for Iran is so high that a majority think the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons.
I think the global community should work against nuclear power and nuclear weapons across the world. How can America be pushing nuclear power on India through a US-India nuclear agreement and say nuclear is good in India but bad in Iran?
Iran is completely surrounded by US forces, naval armadas. The US has complete control of the skies. It has satellite monitoring devices. If the US were to launch, or its ally Israel, which is a proxy for the US, were to launch any kind of military action on Iran, the consequences would be enormous, and they could quickly spin out of control. Iran probably has the second largest reserves of natural gas and oil in the world. Certainly, it's a major factor. If all they had were grapes and pomegranates, it would not be as obsessional as it is for Washington.
And I think oil and gas wars are so wrong, because they're not just wars against a country that controls the oil and gas. They end up being wars against the planet, because when you keep pushing this oil addiction, you are pushing climate change and climate havoc.
But this goes back to the question of survival again. I mean, if nuclear weapons remain, sooner or later they're going to be used in a manner that's massively destructive.
The reason why 20% tends to worry nonproliferation analysts is that even though you're going from 3 to 5% to 20 to 90, the hard part is in the beginning. The hard part is getting the 3 to 5. So the further you go up, the easier it gets. When you're at 20, you're more than halfway on your way to 90% enriched uranium. So the concern among some analysts is if you have a whole bunch of 20% that's sitting around, that might be quickly converted by Iran for use for nuclear weapons. Now, there are some scenarios that suggest that the U.S. or Israel would bomb the Bushehr reactor. And that power plant is not near an urban area, but if you bomb a power plant that's actively working, then you get plumes, and there are radiological concerns there. But I don't think that's on the target list. I think really the core facilities that would draw the attention of a military attack are the enrichment facilities, the Arak reactor, which would a plutonium-based reactor, and there's one that's near Qom. It's not in the holy city of Qom, but it's near Qom, and it's underground, under hundreds of feet of rock. That's not really an urban area, but there are others, Natanz and others that are near urban areas, and so there would be the possibility for civilian and collateral damage.
Whenever a country is attacked, people rally behind its leaders. It's a truism. It happened here in the United States. After September 11th, George W. Bush's popularity ratings were over 90%. It's a natural reaction. In fact, it's the only thing I can think of that could possibly bring the majority of Iranians behind the government they have now. The only way this government could ever reach a point where it has a majority support would be to get somebody to attack them.
Well, first of all, bombing them isn't necessarily going to produce regime change. Normally, when you bomb a country, it produces a rally around the flag effect. That is to say, people rally to their country. The Iranians are proudful people, and they may not like the government, but they certainly won't like Israelis or foreigners bombing them. So the notion that that's going to produce regime change, I think, is fanciful. What I do think it will produce is a decision for them to get the bomb. Again, remember, it's the position of the U.S. intelligence community that Iran has not yet made that decision. They haven't crossed that line. I think bombing them produces the decision to cross the line, and there's historical evidence for that. When Israel bombed Iraq, the U.S. Iraq reactor in Iraq, Saddam Hussein's response to that was to let people who had worked on nuclear weapons in the past out of prison and give that program high priority. It had the exact opposite effect to which it was intended. First of all, if you bomb them, you don't get regime change, and instead what you get is a bomb decision.
It would set back the pro-democracy movement perhaps a generation or two, which would be devastating for a country that already is more than a century into its struggle for democracy. And it would spread a lot of extremism and instability in the region that already is suffering from a lot of extremism and instability. And finally, if it goes as badly as the Iraq and the war and the Afghan war has gone, it could very well lead to a strategic and decisive weakening of the United States beyond what Afghanistan and Iraq already has caused the U.S.
War is brutal, is bloody. It takes a country backward. It destroys all the infrastructure. What can they achieve by having a war? Wars are not only brutal in a very human sense, but they really destroy the culture, society, people's passion for change. You cannot expect a society to be accountable if you put them under such brutal pressure.
I oppose the idea of bombing Iran for several reasons. One, which can't be ignored, is the basic human cost of war, which people who have never been to a war zone may just not be aware of. It takes very little to cause harm to people, even if they don't get shot, even if no one in their family gets harmed. I saw that during my month in Iraq, a time during which I saw very little, frankly. I wasn't out on patrol. I wasn't kicking doors down. I was on bases, but we were bombed routinely by insurgents. I developed a whole lot of symptoms of PTSD, not quite to the level of being diagnosable, but it happened and it happened quickly. I use that as an example of how relatively small the level of exposure to war has to be before you can start to have what I would consider a significant human cost, and it just goes up from there. And this is just the very bottom of the list. The harm that's done is just massive. The displacement that would happen is massive. I mean, people forget that there was something like 7 million people losing their homes in Iraq or leaving their homes because of the new violence, internally displaced people, refugees. You're talking about just destroying people's lives, and those are also still not the people who are actually getting killed or wounded. You're talking about the destruction of livelihoods, the destruction of people's lives.
Any kind of military strike would actually strengthen the regime. It would strengthen the regime for many reasons. One of them being that Iranians are nationalists. They love their country, and they would prefer to be independent with a bad government and try to change it themselves, rather than have an outside power dictate to them what to do or not to do. So aside from the fact that it would create an immense amount of bloodshed and chaos, a strike would definitely weaken the opposition, the pro-democracy movement. It certainly would not improve the situation.
Despite ongoing threats of military action, the United States and Israel have refrained from overtly attacking Iran. Covert actions, however, are another story. 5 Iranian nuclear scientists have been assassinated since 2007. It is widely believed Israel's Mossad and the MEK were responsible for the attacks. The latest assassination occurred in January of 2012, when 2 hitmen on motorcycles slapped magnetic IEDs to the side of Mustafa Ahmadi Roshan's car and rode away as it exploded. In 2010, the United States attacked Iran with a computer virus known as Stuxnet, part of a destabilization effort called Operation Olympic Games. The virus was discovered after it mistakenly spread to computers across the globe.
If you're sitting in Tehran and you see your scientists being assassinated and you see computer viruses attacking and you see sanctions, if you're inclined to look that way, it looks like this is about regime change. And of course, the U.S. did engage in regime change in Iran in the early 1950s.
In the early 1950s, Iran finally managed to consolidate its democracy. Prime Minister Mossadegh was the instrument by which Iranians took back control of their oil. And it was that step, particularly taken in the context of the Cold War, that led the United States to decide we could not tolerate this kind of a government. And we then organized an attack in a covert way that ended up bringing down not only the Mossadegh government, but democracy in Iran.
Operation Ajax was a CIA-run coup d'etat during the Eisenhower administration. The primary planner was Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. Working under CIA Director Allen Dulles, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and President Dwight Eisenhower, Roosevelt was provided with millions of dollars to demonize Prime Minister Mossadegh and pay off royalist sympathizers within the military and government. Roosevelt proceeded to bombard the Iranian media with fake news stories, hired thugs to riot in the streets in the name of Mossadegh, and coordinated the return of the Shah once Mossadegh had been illegally arrested.
Mossadegh was a secular liberal. He believed in elections. He did not believe in a religious influence over government. It is true in a way that Mossadegh didn't seem like the kind of person who would be an enemy of ours or who we would turn into an enemy. He was essentially an elderly aristocrat who despised all socialist and Marxist ideas. He was a feudal landlord who came from a very wealthy family. His father had been finance minister of Iran for a quarter of a century. He had been European educated. He spoke fluent French. He's the first person in the history of Iran to receive a graduate degree in law from a foreign university. A hugely eminent figure. Episodes like the overthrow of a popular government do not simply fall without impacts. If you looked at Iran during the 1950s or 60s, you might have thought that the overthrow of Mossadegh produced no real effect beyond the change of government. You just had the Shah in now. You had a more authoritarian regime. But if you look back now, from the perspective of history, you see some very profound effects. First of all, of course, the overthrow of the Shah brought about the emergence of this strongly anti-Western and fanatically religious regime. That regime also went on to terrify the Soviets because they were afraid it would be duplicated on their own border. That helped propel the Soviets to invade Afghanistan. That's what dragged us into our Afghanistan project and produced the September 11th bombings indirectly. The Islamic Revolution also caught the attention of Saddam Hussein in nearby Iraq. With all the turmoil in Iran, he decided to invade Iran. We then supported Saddam Hussein. That was the beginning of our death embrace of Saddam that spiraled down into the Iraq War. So a lot of history came out of a few weeks in Tehran in the summer of 1953.
Iran is a very diverse country. It's multilingual. It has Arabs, for example. It has Turks. There are Baluch. There are many Kurds in Iran. So it's multilingual, very, very diverse from region to region. But there is a sense of Iranian identity based on the history of the country. There has been something known as Iran or Persia for something like 5,000 years. So that gives them a great deal of pride. Iran is extraordinary, let me say. It is a 5,000-year-old civilization. It is one of the oldest cultures in the world. And Iranians have a very strong sense of who they are. They're very proud of their language, their poetry, their contributions in music and architecture, in other cultural fields. There's a very strong sense of Iraniyat, being Iranian.
The internet culture in Iran is huge. The youth music culture is huge. Western music and movie culture, it's enormous. The raves, the parties, the underground culture is amazing, and it's only barely underground.
خیلی سخته. از اکباتان چی اومدین اینجا؟
اکباتان که 3 بار گرفتم.
ریختن 3 طبقه زیر زمین بود و هیچ کسی آزاری نمی‌رسید. ریختن سازا رو برداشتن بردن، فهم ما هم نبودیم. بعد این کنسرت کسایی هوامون پس یه جور شد.
It's interesting that Iranian cinema has become widely admired throughout the world, and it's gone through a period of a kind of a renaissance, I would say. Ahmad Shamlou was one of the foremost poets, I would say, of contemporary Persian literature. When he died in the year 2000, within hours, there were thousands and thousands of people. To some accounts, there were about 100,000 people there that day, which seems quite interesting to Americans when I tell them, oh, you know, at the poet's funeral, there were 100,000 people, and people were quite surprised about that.
During the war, in the first decade after the revolution, the Islamic regime had banned American movies because it considered them as cultural invasion. But we were frustrated at turning on the television and just seeing clerics preach. So there was a new job in Iran, and there were these young, motivated men, entrepreneurs, who would secretly pirate American movies, Hollywood movies, and bring them to people's homes, and we would rent them. Rayman was very popular. Whatever was coming out, we used to watch the Oscars like within a week after the Academy Award was given out. So we would put our fingers on the movies that were winning the awards and wanted to see those. But we were watching all the other ones as well, movies that were taped off cable programs, MTV shows.
People are living a Western lifestyle in everything but the way they walk around on the streets. There is a tremendous desire to create a political system in which they'll be able to do that openly instead of having to do it behind closed doors.
What does it mean for sanctions to work? And what is the role of sanctions in trying to produce the outcome we want? I mean, people focus on sanctions, more pressure, more pressure, more pressure.
The sanctions have completely crippled Iranian civil society in ways that it hasn't crippled Iranian regime. So if the sanctions were aimed at undermining the Islamic regime, it has helped the regime. People just don't have time to think about human rights, about freedom, about democracy, when they have to worry about bringing food on their tables.
The pro-democracy movement, the backbone of it, according to themselves, is the middle class. And the middle class has been hit really hard, perhaps the hardest when it comes to these sanctions. This is part of the reason why the leaders of the pro-democracy movement from the very beginning came out opposed to the sanctions, saying that this will hurt the pro-democracy movement because it will hurt its backbone, the middle class. And we have seen that. We have testimonies from people who used to be very active 3-4 years ago, organizing, who said, 4 years ago, I was only thinking about social and political freedoms. Today, I'm too preoccupied just trying to make ends meet. I don't have time to focus on the political issues because my economy is such a bad shape as a direct result of the sanctions.
Many policymakers don't want to fight a war. They don't want boots in the ground. They don't want to stand back and sit on their hands and do nothing because that makes them look weak. So sanctions are something everyone, Democrats, Republicans, mothers and fathers, children and grandparents can all get around, to do sanctions. But sanctions alone, by themselves, are almost never the answer to a policy problem. Sanctions, to the extent that they're effective when they were effective with South Africa, when they were effective with Libya, to change behavior, they're part of an integrated approach in which the end result is a diplomatic settlement. There are very few countries that you press down on them and then they say, you're right, we give in, we wave the white flag, we'll do whatever you want. That does not happen in international politics. When sanctions work, they work because there's sanctions and there's diplomacy and there are other things going on as part of an integrated strategy that in the end produces a diplomatic agreement that all sides, including the sanctioned party, can get on board with. There's no law that bans the import of medicines or humanitarian goods into Iran. None of that is being sanctioned. And so in theory, Iran should have access to all of that. What we focused on instead is going after banking, shipping insurance, containers, that sort of thing. One of the problems, though, is the banks are private entities. They can decide what they want to do and what they don't want to do. And because there are all these sanctions laws around banking, they don't want to have anything to do with Iran. So even though it's perfectly legal for them to finance the purchase and transfer of humanitarian-related items, drugs and medical supplies, as private businesses, they're saying, we just don't want any part of this. We don't want to get involved in something where we're going to end up in court or the subject of some sort of investigation or penalty. So we don't want to be involved.
But there was no medicine shortage until the sanctions hit. And it's important to understand that it's not a chicken and egg problem, as some people have said. It's a bad situation that was turned into a deadly situation as a result of the sanctions. And I think this is something that from the Western side there needs to be much more focus on, because Iran is a country in which the population tends to have a relatively benign or positive view of the United States. If you have several years of this taking place in which children are dying from the simplest of diseases because there's no access to medicine, you're not going to end up creating friends or winning any hearts and minds in that country.
Iranians, just like any other nation in the world, they want to have access to information, technology, medicine, everything. And the sanctions are undermining Iranian society, not the government.
This is a country that fought a long and bloody war against Iraq under very difficult circumstances, including Saddam's use of chemical weapons. So they're not going to fold easily.
In September of 1980, with the blessing of the United States, Saddam Hussein attacked Iran. Iran had not invaded another country in 250 years. The war was brutal, with extensive trench warfare, and it lasted almost a decade.
Saddam always had hegemonic dreams in the Middle East. While the Shah was in power, it wasn't possible for him to realize these dreams. Suddenly, Iran was in turmoil. And not only was it taken over by mullahs, but they shot the generals, those that weren't smart enough to flee. One day Saddam woke up and looked over and he said, they don't have any generals. There's no army to speak of. I can take them over. It didn't turn out to be quite that easy, but that's how the war began. Then there was a great alarm in Washington. What do we do? And they finally realized, well, this is our chance to get at Iran. Don't forget that the hostage crisis was going on. This was a period when the United States was in a fanatic anti-Iran mood. And so we embraced Saddam. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, sent an envoy to meet personally with Saddam Hussein. He went twice. That envoy was Donald Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld asked Saddam, what can we do for you to help you defeat Iran? Saddam asked for a couple of things. He wanted surveillance photographs so that he could see where the Iranian troop concentrations were and attack them. And he wanted helicopters. Obviously always good in a close quarter war like that. So the United States did supply intelligence and helicopters to Saddam during that war. And when Iranians run down their list of grievances about the United States, the fact that we were helping Saddam during that horrific 8-year war against Iran is certainly on the list.
I was in 3rd grade, elementary school, when the war broke out. All I can tell you that it was the most horrifying experience of my life. The war started with the bombing of the city, so every night we had to run down our stairs as we heard the sound of the siren, take refuge somewhere safe from the Iraqi bombers that were dropping bombs. It took a while for us to get used to living in a war condition. We put tapes on our windows to sort of limit their shattering in case the bombers dropped a bomb in an area close to our homes. We were always ready to run down the stairs to take shelter. But after a while, we got used to it. We learned how to deal with it. But it was painful that it dragged on for such a long time, for long, 8 years. There was a constant reminder of the bloodshed, of the violence. And these things affect people's souls, especially if they drag on for so many years, almost a decade. The war with Iraq was the longest war in modern history. It left so many people killed, crippled. It affected us in many direct ways. After the war ended, when you go back to Iran's history in the 90s, our first uprising occurred in 1999. That means it took over 10 years for Iranian civil society to come back into action, to put itself together, to come up with ideas, with notions what it wants and where it wants to go.
It's important to remember that Iran is it's a theocracy, right? It's run by a cleric. It's not run by the president. I mean, the president is one of several government institutions in Iran that has power, but the most important, by far, governmental institution in Iran is the supreme leader, who is a religious figure elected by a group of other religious figures. So, in a religious country, religious decrees are important. And then going back to the Iran-Iraq War, what was then the bloodiest war on record in the region, Iraq, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against Iran. Iran did not respond with chemical weapons. The military went to the leader at the time and said, we want to be able to retaliate with chemical weapons, and the military was told, no, that's irreligious, you can't do that. So these things, in a theocracy, religious morals and principles can matter. And they did for the Iran-Iraq War.
I'm against Iran having nuclear weapons. I'm against any new country getting weapons that don't have them. And I'm even in favor of countries that have nuclear weapons complying with their part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and getting rid of them. We shouldn't be moving towards more. We should be moving towards less. In fact, this is the concept of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's essentially a deal between the countries that have the nuclear weapons and the ones that don't. The ones that don't promise not to try to get them. And the ones that do promise that they will build down their arsenals to the point with the goal of trying to reach nothing.
I think nuclear weapons are inherently evil. I think they did restrain the U.S. and the Soviet Union in a rough way during a bumpy part of the Cold War. But ultimately, if you hold on to these weapons long enough, they're going to be used, and when they're used, millions of innocent people will be killed. And I believe in the NPT. I think everyone should follow it. So I think the nuclear weapons states should give up their nuclear weapons, not tomorrow, but be committed to a process that produces disarmament. And I think the states that don't have nuclear weapons should maintain their commitments and not get nuclear weapons. But if we have an Iran with nuclear weapons, that makes the world a more dangerous place, because nuclear weapons are inherently dangerous. I think it could make the Middle East a more dangerous place. Those weapons could eventually be used by accident or in a crisis or through mistakes or miscalculation. But it also means the road to disarmament becomes much more complicated, because the more states that acquire nuclear weapons, the more reluctant the countries that already have them, the US, China, France, Israel, all those countries become more reluctant to living up to their obligations. When the Shah was in charge of Iran, the US was encouraging the Shah to develop nuclear power. In fact, the Shah bought into part of an enrichment consortium, and that fell apart after the Shah was deposed. But in the 70s, when nuclear power was going to solve all our problems, the US and Europe was pressing Iran to develop nuclear energy, even though it had oil. And the argument was, well, if you can supply your own electricity, then you can sell more oil, export more oil, and make more money off it. It was an argument that we made to them in the 1970s, and now it's an argument that they fully embraced. So it's difficult for us to come back and say, oh, you really don't need to do that.
And what does weaponization mean, and where does Iran stand on that end of things?
Well, it's a great question to ask about weaponization, because people think, bang, you get a bomb once you've enriched 90% uranium. And really, we're talking about a process here. I mean, even if you think about North Korea's had nuclear tests, but does it have a reliable, workable, military-grade nuclear weapon? The answer, in my view, is no. The U.S. military certainly wouldn't want to take the devices that North Korea has and incorporate them into the U.S. arsenal. So it's really a continuum here. And Iran is along that continuum, but not very far down. So in everyone's best estimate, Iran has not yet made a decision to build nuclear weapons. So there is no weaponization going on. They haven't made a decision to go down that path yet. They could decide to do so at some point in the future, but they have not made that decision, and that's a critical distinction. Once they make that decision, then they're going to have to, well, in this particular case, they'll probably have to kick out all the inspectors. They'd have to go through, a lot of different steps, but technically speaking, they would enrich uranium to 90%. They would fashion a crude nuclear device. They would test that device. Based on the results of that test, they would figure out what they were doing right, what they were doing wrong. And Iran, if it decided to go to this point, had a nuclear test, then fashioned a nuclear weapon, would probably, like every state in the nuclear age, first to fashion a bomb that would be dropped from a plane. And then it would be sometime later, generations later, I mean, in terms of the design, generations later, where they would then fashion, if this is what their goal was, a warhead that was small enough to fit onto a missile. And then you'd have to have a missile that was highly reliable enough that you can't take chances with nuclear weapons. So you can't really put a warhead on the tip of a missile, fire the missile, and have the missile fail and come tumbling back onto your own country. So the level of reliability here is quite high. Well, nuclear weapons, like chemical weapons, are, if you look at the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, deeply morally problematic because they kill innocents, they destroy the land, they violate all these moral precepts that are at the core of all three Abrahamic traditions, and even more so for Islam than for Christianity. So there have been statements about nuclear weapons being irreligious and haram, being unacceptable, morally unacceptable, forbidden. The president, Ahmadinejad, has mentioned these. The supreme leader has given speeches where he's mentioned it. There's been talk of a fatwa, but no one in the USA has actually seen the text of the fatwa, this religious ruling about the illegitimacy of nuclear weapons. But our Iranian colleagues who are clerics insist that there is a fatwa and are producing materials that they hope to send to be able to demonstrate that this is the case. The U.S. has been sanctioning Iran since the hostage crisis, 1979 hostage crisis. And we've been engaged in tussling over Iran's nuclear program since the late 1990s, and then we've had international involvement, UN Security Council resolutions and that sort of thing since the early 2000s. So this has been going on for, more than a decade, more than 2 decades. So you could hardly call this a race to the bomb. We know because of IAEA inspections, the International Atomic Energy Agency is on the ground every couple of weeks in Iran. Iran is the most watched country in the world, more so than North Korea. IAEA is on the ground. They issue quarterly reports. The Russians are on the ground. The Americans are spying. The Israelis are spying. The Saudis are spying. Everyone is looking at this. And we have a lot of great data about their facilities. And every time they've started to build a facility, even when they haven't announced it, we've known about it in advance.
I think the vast majority of Iranian Americans support the idea that Iran has to become a democracy. They also support the idea that the democracy has to come from within ultimately. It cannot come from outside. Doesn't mean that outside cannot play a helpful role, but it can play the leading role. I think part of the reason why the word regime change, which is used by a lot of people, but it has a connotation that in my personal view is insufficient, is because regime change just means that you change the regime. It doesn't mean that you change the regime for the better. I like the word democratization. I like the word that makes it very clear, where are you heading? You're heading towards a democracy. That has to be the end goal. Regime change is what Iran had in 1979. A dictatorship was thrown out and another dictatorship was put in place. Doing that again, to me, is not particularly valuable. It has to have a positive objective that is very clear from the very outset, and that's why I think the term democratization is more fitting. Also, regime change has a connotation that it's done by the US. That is yet another one of those US-led initiatives, and that I don't think would be successful. I don't doubt that there may be a lot of positive intentions. My doubt is America's capability to positively change a regime in the Middle East and make it sustainable and make it democratic. I have doubts about that, and I think there's plenty of examples in just the last couple of years that regardless of the intent, the capability and capacity simply isn't there.
That it were so easy, but I think actually regime change is unlikely. It's difficult to pull off even if you can start down that path, and you're not necessarily going to get the result that you hope for. And in the meantime, you have a very angry country that probably will decide the next day to pursue nuclear weapons.
Over history, you see that there are effectively 3 models for government of Iran. One is military dictatorship. One is religious rule, and one is, we could call it Mossadegh-style liberal democracy. We're now in a period where we've gone through a quarter of a century of military rule, followed by more than a quarter of a century of religious rule. I sense that many Iranians are feeling like it's time to keep this cycle going and get back to the kind of government that Mossadegh was trying to build in the 50s. Iran's challenge, and I think as many Iranians would feel it, is to try to get back to where we were when the CIA intervention threw us off track in 1953 and start to build the democracy now that we would have tried to build in 1954 and 55 and the years afterward.
The majority of the population in Iran don't like the current regime. The Iranian society is at a stage that no matter what, the regime has to comply with some kind of change. The society is much more ahead of the Iranian government. During the 2009 uprising, the children of many of high-ranking officials were taking part in the demonstrations. Their children were arrested and they were in prison, and newspapers were reporting them. How can you expect a regime whose own children go into prison because they are against the status quo?
The decision about the direction of Iran's government has to lie in the end with the people of Iran. It's not their job to come up with a government or a regime that we like or that looks good to us. Iran has been around as a nation about 10 times longer than the United States, if you want to count it all the way back to its Persian background. Iranians have a very strong sense of themselves and their history.
I have no doubt that democracy will come to Iran very slowly, gradually, but it will be grassroots. And if there is a war, that's going to be delayed for a very long time. That's why a war is scary.
The 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq happened rapidly. Although Iraq was not involved with the September 11th attacks, the fear generated from the attacks was used to promote a U.S. invasion of Saudi Arabia's longtime enemy, Iraq. The lies and manipulation used by the Iraq war lobby are now widely known. Yet, the propaganda for a new war in the Middle East continues.
In the lead up to the Iraq war, the different players you could call the Bomb Iraq lobby employed a lot of tactics that, frankly, we're seeing these days with regard to Iran. One of the primary elements of it was just the fear-mongering that you would see at any time, issuing lots of reports, making it seem like Saddam Hussein was a much greater enemy than he was. Remembering Ahmed Chalabi is a very important thing to do as we look at what's going to happen with Iran. He formed something called the Iraqi National Congress, which he presented as being a top, vibrant opposition group that would be ready to just parachute into Iraq and become a new government. He seemed to be all set to bring in a mass of people, have a kind of the domestic rising of democracy that he could lead, and so it would just be easy. Invade Iraq, take Saddam down, hand it over to Chalabi, you're good to go, focus on what your next steps are. And, you know, as it's been seen, it was just absolutely not the case. Chalabi was a fraudster, had gotten in trouble with the banking regulators in Jordan, had minuscule amount of support within Iraq, and then the news broke eventually that he was actually feeding intelligence to Iran. So not exactly a win. We have to be concerned about that now because there is a parallel group with regard to Iran called the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, also known as the People's Mujahideen of Iran. I'm going to call them the MEK. The Mujahideen-e-Khalq is an Iranian dissident group that over time became a cult, was on the U.S. foreign terrorist organization list for many years until it was recently removed. And its interest is in becoming the new government of Iran. An interesting connection between the MEK and Ahmed Chalabi here, because some of the very same people who have been advocating on behalf of the MEK were advocating on behalf of Ahmed Shalabi, and through some of the reporting done by Ali Garib, who is at one of the editors at Open Zion at the Daily Beast, actually found the specific address where the same people are advocating on behalf of both of them, with the specific interest of more military action in the Middle East.
Media manipulation is a propaganda tactic used by war planners across the globe. This graph was leaked to the Associated Press as proof that Iran was developing nuclear weapons. It was quickly pointed out to the AP that the graph can be found in textbooks used by nuclear engineering students. It was the National Iranian-American Council that led the effort to debunk the bogus graph.
In the AP case, it was so blatant, and it was so reminiscent of what happened in the Iraq War, in which, the most fanciful stories were being thrown out there. So that we immediately organized an action alert, and we started bombarding AP with demands for a retractment of that story, which led to a second story by them in which they were bringing in a lot of the critical voices against that story, which was a way for them to apologize without coming across as they really apologized. But what it really did is that it did not permit that one story to find legs. Because what happens is that you have one fanciful story, but then when 10 other news sources are quoting that, and 10 other are quoting the second, then suddenly it has a life of its own, because there's like tons of news outlets that have been quoting the same thing, so it must be true. And then suddenly it's become a truth. Then you have to disprove that truth, which is much, much tougher. Essentially that story has gotten a life of its own. This story was never permitted to get a life of its own. It was pointed out very quickly, efficiently, forcefully, that this is fanciful, there's no real basis for it, and it died. And you're not seeing any news stories quoting that any longer because we killed it.
This type of coverage and this type of media coverage and the political attention is completely selective and is based on strategic needs of the empire. Since Egypt is in Washington's pocket, since Saudi Arabia is in Washington's pocket, no attention and no censorship is required of those regimes. Since Iran is independent and outside the scope of the U.S. orbit of power, it is to be punished. Its transgressions are to be highlighted.
How important is a free and independent media?
Well, depends whether you care about democracy or not. If you want a democratic society, you're going to have free and independent media. The concept of objectivity is well defined. If something's being debated in Washington and you report one side or the other accurately, you're being objective. If there's something outside the framework of what is commonly accepted in the state corporate system, you're being biased and opinionated, and it's not serious. Well, okay, that's a terrific system for a well-functioning totalitarian state. Keep within the framework of the power centers and present opinions accurately on both sides. That basic framework is stultifying, and it means that lots of things are simply dismissed as not disinterested, not objective, biased, and so on. And there are often things that are right at the center of what people ought to know. A free and independent media wouldn't accept those constraints.
The most extraordinary thing I find in my trips to Iran is how pro-American the Iranian people are. I've never seen anything like this in all my travels in my life. When I was last there, I was standing on a street corner in Shiraz, and somebody came up to me, and we were waiting for the light to change. This asked me where I was from, and when I said America, there was shrieking, and within a couple of seconds I was surrounded by about 8 people. And one woman said to me, "We know they say terrible things about us over there, but we love America so much." You don't even get that in Canada. This is unique in the world. They have an exaggerated, over-idealized view of the United States, and it's quite remarkable considering the circumstances.
The Iranian people definitely do not want a war. It would be the most horrifying thing that can happen to them. They still have very fresh memories of the war with Iraq. As I said, Iranian cemeteries all over the country are filled with the youth who died in the war.
There's a tremendous frustration in Iran, I think, among many people, that the country has fallen so far short of its potential. Nonetheless, there aren't very many people in the world who truly believe that you can bring democracy to a country by bombing it. I guess there still are some people who believe that in Washington, although our last few attempts haven't been so successful. I truly believe that democracy can take hold anywhere, but I think there are two important conditions. One condition is it takes time. Democracy is not just an election. Democracy is a whole way of dealing with life's problems. It takes years and decades and generations for people to adopt this mindset. Actually, Iran is one of the few countries in the Middle East where people have had this time. They had their constitutional revolution more than 100 years ago. All during that time, they've had a constitution, they've had elections, they've had a parliament. The elections haven't always been fair, and the parliament has been restricted, but they have an idea of what is a political party, how do you vote, what are the institutions of government. So Iran qualifies on point one. The second thing I think that you need to have a country develop democracy is that the people in the country have to want it. Western-style electoral democracy is probably the most democratic system for us in the United States. It doesn't work everywhere else because people have different cultures and different backgrounds. I think that Iranians have gotten to the point where this is what they want, but they have not gotten to the point where they think they can get it through a war.
I have no doubt that democracy will come to Iran very slowly, gradually, but it will be grassroots. And if there is a war, that's going to be delayed for a very long time. That's why a war is scary.
People told me in Iran, every time there's a provocative or hostile statement coming out of Washington toward Iran, the leadership in the country turns the screws on the democratic elements, saying, you know, you're enabling this. You two are connected. The pressure we're getting from the United States is directly, you know, connected to what you're doing inside the country. So it actually undermines the possibility for democratic change in Iran.
I've often reflected on this question. I've asked myself, since engaging with Iran and trying to build up civil society in Iran and trying to establish trade with Iran, not pushing Iran into a corner and sanctioning it and hectoring it all the time, but trying to bring it into regional security arrangements, might produce a strong, stable, nationalist, democratic Iran. Therefore, why are we not doing that? And I think the logical answer one would give is, we don't agree that that's what it would produce, or that's not possible. But I do ask myself sometimes this question. Couldn't there be some people in Washington who would think, you know, strong, self-confident, stable, prosperous, democratic Iran, is that really good for us? Maybe miserable, unhappy, poor, backward, isolated Iran is better for us. I hope people are not making that calculation in Washington, but I fear at least some are.
It's not just about oil and natural gas. It's also about hegemony and control and vengeance. Punishing Iran for overthrowing a very close ally of the United States. The Shah of Iran was like a cash cow for the U.S. military-industrial complex. He was buying billions and billions of dollars of weapons. And so they've never forgiven Iran for overthrowing the Shah and the Islamic Revolution. And that's also part of the equation, to restore a compliant, servile, subservient regime in Tehran that will answer the bidding of Washington. So when American presidents, be they Obama or Bush or Reagan or Kennedy, say that the United States is committed to democracy, the red flag should go up in the citizen's mind. Wait a second, what about democracy in Chile? Wasn't that a democratically elected government? Wasn't Salvador Allende elected? Didn't the CIA destroy democracy in Chile and in other countries as well? Aren't we supporting a homophobic, misogynistic, feudal dictatorship in Saudi Arabia? The U.S. is clearly not committed to democracy. It has set up a protectorate in Afghanistan. It's almost, again, it's risible. You have rigged elections, bought votes. The puppet there, his name is Hamid Karzai, I think a former Unocal oil consultant, may have been also a CIA asset at one point. He's one of the most corrupt leaders on earth. In Iraq itself, we have been the handmaidens to a new dictatorship there, basically Shia-based, led by al-Maliki. So clearly we're not spreading democracy, we're actually limiting democracy.
What's public opinion in the Arab world? I mean, that would seem to be important. In fact, it's crucial. In fact, it is crucial. And the planners certainly know about it, even though there's been no reporting in the press. Although the facts are well known. Their polls are taken by the major U.S. polling agencies, released by prestigious institutions and so on, but the media sit on them. They're not, if you bring them up, you're not being objective in a technical sense. What they show is that if there were authentic democracies in the region, that is, political systems in which public policy reflected public opinion, that's what democracy is supposed to be, the United States not only wouldn't control the region, it would be excluded. The main non-Arab power in the region is Turkey. Turkey refuses to go along with U.S. policy. In fact, it's improving its relations with Iran. It's just announced a tripling of trade. It opened a new pipeline. They're natural trading partners. Brazil, which is the most admired country in the South, is also quite supportive of they don't like Iran's internal politics, but in the conflict, they tend to support Iran. I think the United States is wrong. Along with Turkey, they've tried to broker an independent solution to the uranium enrichment problem. The U.S. shot it down very quickly. The non-aligned countries, it's most of the world, have vigorously and repeatedly announced their support for Iran's right to develop nuclear weapons. I mean, that's the world. We may say the world is wrong if we like. Okay, we can say that. But we ought to know that the United States is isolated, very isolated, and to carry out isolated even of its present policies of threats. The threats, incidentally, are in violation of the UN Charter, if anyone cares, but even the threats are extremely unpopular. An invasion would just be a horror story.
At some point, there's going to have to be a fundamental break where both sides do something to demonstrate that they are serious and that there's a real possibility here. And so what does that end agreement look like? I don't know what it all looks like, but it probably looks like Iran's going to be allowed to enrich either nationally or multinationally, that would be my preference, 3 to 5%, but with constraints. That Iran's going to be much more transparent. Forward-leaning transparent rather than reluctantly transparent, that it's allowed to settle up its past mistakes. I mean, Iran had a bomb program. I believe that it had a bomb program that it stopped in 2003. Now, we don't have to cross every T and dot every I to find out exactly what happened, but we have to settle up on that somehow. And for its part, the U.S. has to make clear that if Iran does these things, stops producing 20%, doesn't stockpile 20%, is more open and transparent, well, that the U.S. is going to remove sanctions. And I think there's a real question whether that's going to happen or not, because I can easily imagine U.S. Congress saying, after Iran goes through a series of steps, does what it's supposed to do, and then Congress is asked, please remove these sanctions, and I can imagine Congress saying, no, we're going to keep them and we're going to add more. Well, that's not going to work either.
I think that the situation has changed. There is no neocon rhetoric, and hopefully there will be a chance for negotiations. Unfortunately, the sanctions are not helping.
What would you like to see come out of the Obama administration in the coming months or years?
I think what would be really needed from the Obama administration is to invest in the type of diplomacy that can succeed. Limited diplomacy cannot succeed. Instantaneous diplomacy cannot succeed. It has to be the type of diplomacy that is patient, that is long-term, that is broad in the sense of not just talking about the nuclear issue. We have to talk about human rights. We have to talk about regional issues. I think that would be extremely valuable. I understand the difficulties that the administration is facing with, one of them being that it would be very politically risky for them to go down that path and spend political capital on that issue if there's no indication that the Iranians would do the same thing on their end. If the Iranian government is not coming to the table with the same determination, with the same persistence and patience, then it could be a waste for the administration to challenge the forces of status quo in Washington by going down that path. But ultimately, I think this is an issue that is sufficiently important, has such a significant strategic value for the United States, that it is something that we have to consistently pursue. Absence of resolution to this issue, I don't think we are in a status quo that is motionless. The status quo has a motion, and that motion is a steady gravitation towards a military confrontation.
You know, the U.S. and Iran don't have diplomatic relations, and which I think is a problem. You know, you don't need to talk to your friends, they're your friends. You need to talk to your enemies. And not because you're being nice to them, not because it's a reward, but because it's smart foreign policy. So they know exactly what you mean when you say something, and they don't have to decipher tea leaves or have people whisper in their ear or interpret what your meanings are. You can have direct face-to-face exchanges. We had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. We had diplomatic relations, with China. We've had diplomatic relations with, virtually all our enemies except Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. And I think that just doesn't make any sense, sheerly from a self-interest practical standpoint.
I think the best outcome that we could achieve, and I'm not saying this is the realistic outcome, but the best outcome would be one in which the US and Iran have a bilateral. In that bilateral, they talk about regional issues as well as human rights and the nuclear issue. We managed to resolve the nuclear issue going for the most logical conclusion there is, which is Iran has to accept full transparency and limitation to its nuclear program. And the US will accept that there will be enrichment in Iran below 3.5%. And that the Iranians will sign the additional protocol and have all of those transparency and verification processes in place. If that can be done, then hopefully there can also be an addressment of the regional issues that are causing so much instability. And if we can then reduce all of those tensions, I think it will open up the space inside of Iran to be able to give breathing room for the pro-democracy movement. And then they can do what they can do much better than we can do, which is to change Iran from inside in a much more positive, liberal, open, democratic direction. That would be the most pleasant outcome. Will it be taking place in this rather neat way that I explained? Most likely not. But it is achievable. It may take much longer. And I think it's critical that the US puts human rights on the agenda so that we don't just strike a security deal as we have done in that region for so many times, but also recognize that the human rights issue is a strategic component. It's something that enables relations to withstand time, to be able to endure, because there's something more than just short-term security needs and interests that are the foundation of a relationship.
I think it's reasonable to suspect that Iranians could have some grudges against the United States. After all, look around what's happening in Iran right now, and many people could spin out a tale under which this wouldn't be happening at all. We might have been living under a free country had it not been for the United States coming in and crushing our democracy. So given all of this, why is there such a strong pro-American feeling among many Iranians? I wouldn't say it's universal, but it's probably at least as widespread as anywhere else in the world. First of all, I think a lot of time has passed since the Mossadegh episode. Generations have passed. The great hopes that many Iranians had for the revolutionary regime have not been realized. In addition, I think the United States does represent a beacon of hope, not just to Iranians, but for many, many people around the world. It's always remarkable to me to understand this. Despite all of our sins in the world, the United States is still a place that many people in the world admire. They admire the fact that we have a measure of freedom, that we have political stability, that we have some kind of predictability of life. And as I've heard many times, it's a country where if you work hard, you can get somewhere. people admire the opportunity that is available in the United States. I have to think that if Israel were not as concerned about Iran, the United States would not be as concerned about Iran. If for some reason the Israelis would decide tomorrow that they don't care about Iran anymore and they have a fine relation with Iran, I think all the air would go out of the anti-Iran bubble in Washington very, very quickly. You don't have to take this in a cynical way. It may be that there are people in Washington who take Israel's strategic calculations very seriously and want to be wherever the Israelis want them to be. But whether or not that's the case, or whether there are more political reasons for it, the fact is that pressure from Israel is a dominant driving factor in the intensity of the anti-Iran feeling in Washington. You wouldn't have this depth of emotion if there weren't something else driving it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have so many people who cannot find Iran on a map so eager to bomb it. On my last visit to Israel, I heard a private talk from one of the senior Israeli security figures, and he made clear that nobody in the Israeli security establishment really believes that Iran would use a nuclear weapon to attack Israel. He said, we allow this impression to be given because it sounds like it's logical, although those of us that are journalists are always trained to remember that something that looks logical and makes perfect sense might not be true. But he said there's two other reasons why we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. It's not that we think they're going to bomb us, because they know this will result in their instant liquidation as a state, and they are not that suicidal. But first of all, this Israeli official said, we're worried about an arms race in the region. Saudi Arabia will want a nuclear weapon, then it's going to be Turkey, then it's going to be Egypt, and pretty soon we really have trouble. And secondly, he said, when you have a nuclear weapon, you don't have to use it. That's the beauty of it. You can intimidate people by having it. And the Israelis probably have some experience with that. So I actually, from my conversations in Israel, including with some people that are in positions of authority, I conclude that the Israelis don't really fear that a nuclear weapon would result in the liquidation of Israel. They fear that it would result in the strengthening of Iran, and that alone is enough for them to be against it. This is a country where people have been living for thousands of years within more or less the same boundaries, speaking more or less the same language. It has a tremendously rich cultural and political history. It is not a country for the outside world to take lightly and think that we can just push them around like some tiny little African republic or Central American dictatorship. This is a country that not only has a strong sense of itself, but has a great deal to contribute to the world. I hope the world can arrange a relationship with Iran so that Iran can emerge from its isolation and share this richness with the rest of us.